Little boy's fishing trip fatal as giant pike eats him. In the heart of a quiet lakeside town, a legend had taken root. Whispered tales of a monstrous pike lurking beneath the placid waters. For generations, the town had relied on the lake for sustenance and livelihood, its depths providing a bounty of fish. But as the years passed, fear began to eclipse gratitude, and the once revered lake became a place of dread. Among the townspeople, none dismissed the legend more vehemently than Clayton Voss, a wealthy landowner and fisherman known for his relentless pursuit of the lake's resources. With each passing season, Clayton tightened his grip on the town's fishing industry, his nets growing heavy with the fruits of others' labor. He scoffed at the whispers of the monstrous pike, dismissing them as mere superstition, a tool to keep the fearful in line while he reaped the rewards. But there were those who knew better, those who understood that legends often held kernels of truth. One such believer was Old Tom, a retired fisherman who had spent his life on the lake's waters. He saw the signs, the strange ripples on calm days, the shadows that seemed to move against the current. And he feared that one day, the town's hubris would awaken something ancient and terrible. As the sun rose over the lake, casting a golden glow across its mirror-like surface, Old Tom prepared for a day of fishing with his grandson, Tommy. The boy, barely 12 years old, had inherited his grandfather's love for the lake and the stories it held. Together, they set out in a small boat, their lines cast into the depths, hoping for a catch to bring home to Tommy's mother, Evelyn. Evelyn, a woman of quiet strength, had endured more than her share of loss. Her husband, a fisherman like his father, had been lost to the lake's depths years before, leaving her to raise Tommy alone. Despite the hardships, she found solace in her son's boundless curiosity and the unwavering support of the town's elders, who saw in her a resilience that could weather any storm. As Old Tom and Tommy drifted across the lake, the old man shared stories of the monstrous pike, his voice low and filled with warning. Tommy listened wide-eyed, his young mind grappling with the idea of a creature so vast and ancient lurking beneath the boat. But even as the legend took hold in his imagination, Tommy couldn't help but feel a flicker of excitement, a longing to see the beast for himself. Little did they know that their peaceful morning on the lake was about to take a tragic turn, one that would shake the very foundations of their community and set in motion a chain of events that would test the limits of their courage and resilience. Clayton Voss stood at the edge of the lake, his eyes narrowed against the glare of the sun on the water. He had risen early, as he always did, to survey his domain, the sprawling expanse of the lake that he considered his own personal fiefdom. As he watched Old Tom's boat drift lazily across the surface, a sneer curled his lip. The old man's foolish adherence to the legend of the monstrous pike was an annoyance, a thorn in his side that he longed to pluck out. But Clayton had more pressing matters to attend to. His nets, sprawling and vast, had been laid out the night before, ready to haul in a massive catch. He had spared no expense in their construction, using the finest materials and the most advanced techniques. The thought of the bounty that awaited him filled Clayton with a greedy anticipation, a hunger for wealth and power that could never be sated. As he made his way to the docks, Clayton barked orders at his crew, a ragtag group of men who had been lured by the promise of steady work and a share of the profits. They scurried to do his bidding, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and resentment. Clayton paid them no mind, his focus solely on the task at hand. With a roar of the boat's engine, Clayton set out across the lake, his nets trailing behind him like a great hungry maw. He guided the boat with a sure hand, his eyes scanning the water for signs of movement. And then, just as he was about to give the order to haul in the nets, he saw it. A shadow beneath the surface, vast and dark, moving with a speed and grace that seemed impossible for a creature of such size. For a moment, Clayton felt a flicker of doubt, a nagging sense that perhaps the legend of the monstrous pike was more than mere superstition. But he pushed the thought aside, his greed and arrogance overriding any hint of caution. With a savage grin, he gave the order to winch in the nets, his crew straining against the weight of their catch. And then, with a sudden, sickening lurch, the boat began to tip. its balance upset by the sheer mass of whatever had become entangled in the nets. Clayton barked orders, his voice rising in panic as he realized the danger they were in. But it was too late. With a final, wrenching groan, the boat capsized, spilling its occupants into the dark, churning waters of the lake. From the shore, the townspeople watched in horror as Clayton's boat disappeared beneath the waves, the monstrous shape of something vast and terrible breaking the surface for a brief, terrifying moment before vanishing into the depths once more. And in that moment, they knew that the legend of the monstrous Pike was no mere story. It was a truth they could no longer ignore. As news of the capsized boat spread through the town like wildfire, Evelyn felt a cold knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She had seen old Tom and Tommy set out earlier that morning, and now, with the lake's surface churning with chaos, she couldn't help but fear the worst. With a determined set to her jaw, Evelyn made her way to the lakeshore, her steps quickening as she drew closer to the water's edge. Around her, the townspeople gathered in stunned silence, their faces etched with a mixture of disbelief and dread. Some whispered prayers, their eyes closed and their hands clasped tightly before them. Others simply stared out at the lake, their gazes haunted and distant. As Evelyn scanned the water, her heart racing, she caught sight of a small boat drifting aimlessly near the shore. With a gasp, she recognized it as old Tom's, the same boat that had carried her son out onto the lake just hours before. Without a second thought, she waded out into the shallows, her skirts tangling around her legs as she fought against the current. When she reached the boat, Evelyn hauled herself over the side, her eyes wide with fear and hope. But what she found inside made her blood run cold. There, huddled in the bottom of the boat, was old Tom, his face ashen and his eyes filled with a horror she had never seen before. And beside him, where Tommy should have been, there was only empty space. "Where is he?" Evelyn demanded, her voice breaking with emotion. "Where's my son?" Old Tom shook his head, his gaze haunted and distant. "It took him," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the lapping of the waves. "The monster, it took him." Evelyn felt as though the world had dropped out from beneath her feet. She sank to her knees, her hands gripping the sides of the boat as she struggled to breathe. Around her, the townspeople watched in stunned silence, their faces etched with a mixture of pity and fear. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Evelyn felt a flicker of something else, a spark of determination that refused to be extinguished. She had lost too much already, her husband, her father, and now, it seemed, her son. But she would not let the lake take anything else from her. She would not let the monster win. With a fierce determination burning in her eyes, Evelyn stood up, her gaze fixed on the churning waters of the lake. She knew what she had to do, knew that she would stop at nothing to find her son and bring him home. And as she turned to face the townspeople, her voice ringing out clear and strong, she knew that she would not be alone in her fight. "We have to find him," she said, her words filled with a quiet, unwavering resolve. "We have to stop this monster, once and for all." As the sun began to set over the lake, casting long shadows across the water, the townspeople gathered in the community hall, a simple, wooden structure that had served as a meeting place for generations. They came from all corners of the town, fishermen and farmers, shopkeepers and school teachers, united by a shared sense of grief and a determination to act. At the front of the room stood Evelyn, her face etched with a quiet, unwavering strength. Beside her, old Tom leaned heavily on his cane, his eyes still haunted by the horror he had witnessed on the lake. And around them, the elders of the town sat in solemn silence, their weathered faces lined with wisdom and sorrow. As the last of the townspeople filed in, Evelyn cleared her throat, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "We all know why we're here," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "The monster in the lake has taken one of our own, my son Tommy, and we cannot let this stand." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, heads nodding and hands clenching into fists. Evelyn waited for the noise to subside before continuing, her voice filled with a quiet intensity. "For too long, we have lived in fear of this creature, this legend that we thought was nothing more than a story. But now we know the truth, and we must act. She turned to old Tom, her eyes softening with sympathy. "Tell us what you saw," she said gently. "Tell us what happened on the lake." With a heavy sigh, old Tom began to speak, his voice trembling with emotion. He told of the shadow beneath the water, of the terrible roar that had shaken the very air around them. He spoke of the moment when the monster had risen from the depths, its massive jaws closing around Tommy's small, fragile form. As he spoke, the townspeople listened in horrified silence, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear. Some wept openly, their shoulders shaking with grief. Others simply stared ahead, their expressions hardened with a grim determination. When old Tom had finished, Evelyn turned back to the crowd, her voice filled with a quiet, unwavering conviction. "We cannot bring back those we have lost," she said softly, "but we can honor their memory by ensuring that no one else suffers the same fate. We must stand together, as a community, and face this monster head-on." Around the room, heads nodded in agreement, voices rising in a chorus of support. And as the meeting drew to a close, a sense of purpose settled over the town, a shared resolve to confront the darkness that had haunted them for so long. But even as they made their plans and rallied their courage, none could shake the feeling that the true battle was yet to come, that the monster in the lake was not the only enemy they would face in the days ahead. As dawn broke over the town, a strange stillness hung in the air, a sense of anticipation mixed with dread. The townspeople moved about their daily tasks with a newfound purpose, their faces set with determination and their eyes filled with a quiet, unwavering resolve. At the center of it all was Evelyn, her grief tempered by a fierce, unyielding strength. She had spent the night in restless wakefulness, her mind churning with plans and possibilities. And now, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, she knew that the time had come to act. With a small group of the town's most experienced fishermen at her side, Evelyn made her way down to the lakeshore, her steps measured and purposeful. They carried with them a collection of nets and harpoons, their weapons gleaming in the morning light. And as they boarded their boats and set out across the water, a sense of unity settled over them, a shared sense of purpose that transcended their individual fears and doubts. But even as they scoured the lake for signs of the monster, a new threat was emerging from within their own ranks. Clayton Voss, his pride wounded and his greed unchecked, had survived the capsizing of his boat. And now, he was determined to take back control of the lake and its resources, no matter the cost. With a group of his most loyal followers at his side, Clayton made his way through the town, his voice dripping with false sympathy and barely concealed contempt. He spoke of the foolishness of chasing legends, of the need to prioritize the town's economic interests over the grieving of a single family. And to the horror of those who had rallied around Evelyn, some began to listen, swayed by Clayton's promises of prosperity and stability, or simply too afraid to stand against him. As the sun began to set over the lake, the town found itself divided, caught between the desperate search for a lost child and the machinations of a man who cared for nothing beyond his own power and wealth. But even as the tensions mounted and the fractures deepened, there were those who refused to give up hope, who believed that the town's true strength lay not in the schemes of the wealthy, but in the courage and compassion of its people. And so, as the darkness gathered and the monster lurked beneath the surface, the stage was set for a battle that would test the very soul of the community. A fight not just against the beast in the lake, but against the greed and selfishness that threatened to tear them apart from within. Days turned into weeks as the search for Tommy stretched on, the hope that had buoyed the townspeople slowly giving way to a grim, unrelenting despair. The lake, once a source of life and sustenance, had become a haunted place, a realm of shadows and secrets that seemed to mock their every effort. But even as the search parties returned empty-handed and the whispers of defeat began to circulate, Evelyn refused to give up hope. Day after day, she took to the water, her eyes scanning the depths for any sign of her son. And when the sun set and the boats returned to shore, she would pace the lakeshore, her gaze fixed on the horizon as if by sheer force of will she could summon Tommy back from the abyss. It was on one such evening that Evelyn found herself approached by a group of the town's elders. men and women who had seen the community through countless trials and tribulations. They came to her not with platitudes or empty condolences, but with a quiet, steadfast offer of support. "We know your pain," said one, a weathered old fisherman with eyes that sparkled with wisdom, "and we know that the road ahead will be long and hard. But you must remember, Evelyn, you are not alone in this fight." Evelyn felt her throat tighten with emotion, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She had been so focused on her own grief, so consumed by the weight of her loss, that she had almost forgotten the strength that lay in the hearts of those around her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. "I don't know what I would do without you, without all of you." The elders nodded, their faces etched with understanding. And as they took their leave, Evelyn felt a flicker of something she had not felt in weeks. A sense of hope, fragile and tenuous, but real nonetheless. But even as the town rallied around Evelyn, Clayton Voss was not idle. With each passing day, he worked to tighten his grip on the community, using his wealth and influence to sow discord and doubt. He whispered poison in the ears of the fearful and the weak-willed, promising them safety and prosperity if only they would abandon the foolish quest for a lost child. And slowly, insidiously, his message began to take hold. Fishermen who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Evelyn now cast furtive glances in her direction, their loyalty wavering in the face of Clayton's threats. Shopkeepers who had once offered their support now turned away, too afraid of losing Clayton's business to risk his wrath. As the weeks wore on and the search for Tommy continued to yield no results, Evelyn found herself increasingly isolated within the community, where once she had been surrounded by friends and neighbors eager to offer their support. Now she was met with averted gazes and whispered condolences that rang hollow in her ears. But even as the town began to fracture around her, Evelyn found solace in the small acts of kindness that still managed to shine through the darkness. The elderly widow who left a basket of fresh-baked bread on her doorstep each morning. The young boy who offered to help repair her weathered fishing nets, his small hands working with a skill beyond his years. The fisherman's wife who sat with her on the lakeshore each evening, listening to her stories of Tommy with a quiet, unwavering compassion. It was these moments, these small seeds of hope and connection, that kept Evelyn going even as the shadows lengthened and the monster in the lake seemed to grow more elusive with each passing day. But while Evelyn drew strength from the kindness of others, Clayton Voss was sowing seeds of a different kind. With each passing week, his influence over the town grew stronger, his web of lies and manipulation spreading like a cancer through the heart of the community. He spoke of the futility of Evelyn's search, of the need to move on and focus on the future rather than dwelling on the past. He promised wealth and prosperity to those who aligned themselves with him, and whispered dark rumors about those who dared to stand in his way. And slowly, insidiously, his poison began to take hold. Fishermen who had once been loyal to Evelyn now turned their backs on her, too afraid of losing their livelihoods to risk Clayton's wrath. Merchants who had once offered their support now closed their doors to her, too dependent on Clayton's business to risk his displeasure. But even as the town began to turn against her, Evelyn refused to lose hope. She knew that the path ahead would be long and hard, that there would be trials and setbacks at every turn. But she also knew that she could not abandon her son, could not let the monster in the lake claim another innocent life. And so, with a fierce determination burning in her heart, Evelyn pressed on, searching the depths of the lake by day and poring over ancient texts and maps by night, desperate for any clue that might lead her to her missing child. Little did she know that the key to unraveling the mystery of the lake lay not in the water itself, but in the dark secrets that Clayton Voss had been hiding for so long. Secrets that threatened to tear the town apart and plunge them all into an abyss from which there might be no escape. As the long, hot days of summer gave way to the crisp chill of autumn, a sense of unease began to settle over the town. The trees along the lakeshore turned to shades of crimson and gold, their leaves whispering secrets in the wind. And as the nights grew longer and the shadows deepened, the townspeople began to speak of strange sightings and eerie sounds that seemed to emanate from the depths of the lake itself. Some spoke of ghostly figures glimpsed in the mist, their faces twisted in silent screams of agony. Others whispered of ancient curses and forgotten gods, of dark rituals performed on the lakeshore under the light of the full moon. And through it all, the specter of the monstrous Pike loomed large, a shadow that seemed to grow longer and more menacing with each passing day. But even as the town descended into a miasma of fear and superstition, Evelyn remained focused on her quest. She had long since abandoned any hope of finding Tommy alive. The weeks had stretched into months, and she knew that no child could survive so long in the clutches of the beast. But still, she pressed on, determined to uncover the truth behind the legend of the monstrous Pike, and to bring some measure of justice to the memory of her son. It was on a cold, moonless night that Evelyn finally found the breakthrough she had been searching for. She had been poring over an ancient map of the lake, tracing the faded lines with a fingertip, when she noticed a small symbol etched into the parchment, a mark that she had never seen before. With a sudden surge of excitement, Evelyn reached for the stack of books and manuscripts that she had accumulated over the months, texts that spoke of the lake's dark history and the secrets that lay hidden beneath its surface. And there, in a crumbling volume that smelled of dust and decay, she found what she had been looking for. The symbol on the map was a rune, an ancient mark of power that had been used by the indigenous people who had once called the lake their home. And according to the text, the rune was linked to a sacred site hidden deep within the forest that bordered the lake, a place where the spirits of the land were said to hold sway. With a mounting sense of urgency, Evelyn gathered her supplies and set out into the night, determined to uncover the truth behind the rune and to finally put an end to the reign of terror that had gripped the town for so long. But even as she made her way through the darkened woods, Evelyn could not shake the feeling that she was being watched, that some malevolent force was tracking her every move. And as she drew closer to the sacred site, she began to hear whispers in the wind, voices that seemed to call out to her from beyond the veil of death itself. Little did she know that the secrets she was about to uncover would not only shatter the lies that Clayton Voss had been telling for so long, but would also reveal a truth so terrifying that it threatened to destroy everything she had ever known. A truth that would force her to confront the monster in the lake and the darkness that lurked within her own heart. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows and secrets, the gnarled branches of the trees reaching out like grasping fingers to snag at Evelyn's clothes as she pushed her way deeper into the underbrush. The air was thick with the scent of decay and the sound of unseen creatures skittering through the fallen leaves. And more than once, Evelyn found herself whirling around, certain that she had caught a glimpse of something moving in the darkness behind her. But still, she pressed on, guided by the faded map and the flickering light of her lantern. She had come too far to turn back now, had sacrificed too much in her quest for the truth to let fear or doubt stand in her way. At last, after what felt like an eternity of stumbling through the undergrowth, Evelyn emerged into a small clearing. The ground was covered in a thick carpet of moss, and at the center of the glade stood a massive oak tree, its trunk twisted and gnarled with age. And there, at the base of the tree, was the rune, the ancient symbol that had led her to this place. It was carved into the bark, the lines of the mark pulsing with an eerie, otherworldly light. With a trembling hand, Evelyn reached out to touch the rune, her fingers tracing the lines of the symbol as if of their own accord. And in that moment, the world around her seemed to shift and warp, the shadows of the forest melting away to reveal a scene from another time, a vision of the past that had been hidden for so long. She saw the indigenous people who had once called this land their home, saw them gathering around the base of the oak tree in reverent silence as their shaman performed a sacred ritual. She saw them offering up prayers and sacrifices to the spirits of the lake, begging for protection and guidance in the face of the dark forces that threatened to destroy them. And then, with a sudden, sickening lurch, the vision shifted, and Evelyn found herself staring into the eyes of a monster. It was the Pike, but not the creature of legend that she had heard so many stories about. This was something else entirely. A being of pure evil that radiated a malevolence so intense that it seemed to suck the very air from her lungs. Evelyn stumbled backwards, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to make sense of what she had seen. And in that moment, she knew that everything she had believed about the lake and the monster that lurked beneath its surface had been a lie, a deception orchestrated by none other than Clayton Voss himself. With a sudden, awful clarity, Evelyn realized the truth. that Clayton was not simply a greedy, power-hungry man, but something far worse. He was a servant of the monster in the lake, a willing pawn in a game of corruption and deceit that had been playing out for generations. And now, armed with this terrible knowledge, Evelyn knew that she had no choice but to confront Clayton and put an end to his reign of terror once and for all, to finally bring justice to the memory of her son and to free the town from the grip of the darkness that had held it captive for so long. Evelyn's mind raced as she made her way back through the forest, the revelations of the sacred site still echoing in her thoughts. She had always known that Clayton Voss was a man driven by greed and a lust for power, but never in her wildest dreams had she imagined the true depths of his corruption. As she emerged from the trees and made her way back towards the town, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that everything she had ever known had been a lie, that the very fabric of her reality had been woven from threads of deceit and manipulation. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Evelyn felt a flicker of something else stirring in her heart, a spark of determination that refused to be extinguished. She had come too far to give up now, had sacrificed too much in her quest for the truth to let Clayton's lies go unchallenged. And so, with a fierce resolve burning in her eyes, Evelyn marched into town, ready to confront the man who had betrayed them all. She found him in his grand mansion on the hill, surrounded by his sycophants and lackeys, men who had sold their souls for a share of his ill-gotten gains. At first, Clayton tried to play the part of the concerned benefactor, the man who had only ever wanted what was best for the town. But as Evelyn laid out the truth of his deceptions, his mask of civility began to slip, revealing the twisted, malevolent creature that lurked beneath. With a snarl of rage, Clayton lashed out at Evelyn, his eyes blazing with a hatred that seemed to burn with an unholy fire. But even as he advanced on her, his fists clenched and his face contorted with fury, Evelyn stood her ground, knowing that the only way to defeat the monster was to confront it head-on. And then, just as all seemed lost, the town elders stepped forward, men and women who had seen the community through countless trials and tribulations. They stood shoulder to shoulder with Evelyn, their faces etched with a grim determination as they faced down the man who had betrayed them all. In that moment, something shifted in the air, a sense of unity and purpose that had been missing for so long. And as the townspeople began to rally around Evelyn, their voices raised in a chorus of defiance, Clayton's facade of power began to crumble. With a final, desperate howl of rage, the wealthy fisherman fled into the night, leaving behind a town that had finally awakened from the long nightmare of his reign. And as the dust settled and the townspeople began to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, Evelyn knew that the true battle was still to come, that the monster in the lake would not rest until it had claimed its final victim. But even as the darkness gathered and the future seemed uncertain, Evelyn could feel the seeds of hope taking root in her heart, a quiet, unshakable belief that together, they could weather any storm and emerge stronger than ever before. And so, with a fierce determination burning in her eyes, Evelyn turned her gaze towards the lake, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, and to finally put an end to the reign of terror that had haunted their town for so long. In the days that followed the confrontation with Clayton Voss, a strange sense of calm seemed to settle over the town. The once bustling streets were quiet, as if the entire community was holding its breath, waiting for the final battle that they all knew was coming. Evelyn spent her days in feverish preparation, poring over the ancient texts and maps that she had uncovered in her quest for the truth. She knew that the key to defeating the monster lay somewhere within those crumbling pages, that the secrets of the lake and the creatures that lurked beneath its surface were waiting to be unlocked. And then, on a cold, moonless night, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Evelyn was hunched over a faded manuscript, her eyes straining to make out the faded lines of text, when she stumbled upon a passage that made her heart skip a beat. As the chant grew louder and more insistent, the monster began to falter, its movements growing sluggish and uncoordinated, as if some unseen force was dragging it back down into the depths. And then, with a final, desperate roar, the creature vanished beneath the surface, its massive bulk disappearing into the murky waters as if it had never been. For a long, stunned moment, the townspeople stood in silence, scarcely daring to believe that the nightmare was finally over. And then, as if in a dream, Evelyn felt a small, warm hand slip into her own, and looked down to see Tommy standing beside her, his face lit with a radiant, joyful smile. At that moment, Evelyn knew that the curse of the lake had finally been lifted, that the monster that had haunted their town for so long had been banished back to the abyss. And as the townspeople erupted into cheers of relief and celebration, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. A quiet, unshakable knowledge that, at long last, they were finally free. In the weeks that followed the banishment of the monster, the town began to heal, slowly at first, and then with a speed and resilience that surprised even the most optimistic among them. The fishermen returned to the lake, their nets once again heavy with the bounty of the waters. The merchants reopened their shops, their shelves stocked with goods from far and wide. And in the evenings, the streets once again echoed with the sounds of laughter and music, a joyful cacophony that seemed to chase away the last lingering shadows of the nightmare they had endured. At the center of it all was Evelyn, the woman who had lost everything, and yet who had somehow found the strength to lead her people out of the darkness. She became a symbol of hope and resilience, a living embodiment of the unbreakable spirit that had carried the town through its darkest hour. And yet, even as the community began to thrive once again, Evelyn knew that the work of healing was far from over. The scars left by Clayton Voss and the monster he had served ran deep, and it would take time and patience, and no small amount of courage to fully mend the wounds that had been inflicted. And so, with a quiet determination, Evelyn set to work, reaching out to those who had been most deeply hurt by the darkness, offering them the support and compassion that they so desperately needed. She organized community gatherings and festivals, creating spaces where people could come together to share their stories and their hopes for the future. And slowly, bit by bit, she began to see the seeds of a new, brighter tomorrow taking root in the hearts of her neighbors. But even as the town began to flourish, Evelyn never forgot the lessons that she had learned in the depths of her despair. She knew that the true strength of a community lay not in its wealth or its power, but in the bonds of love and compassion that held it together. And she made it her mission to nurture those bonds, to create a place where every person, no matter their background or their struggles, could find a sense of belonging and purpose. As the years passed and the town continued to thrive, Evelyn found herself taking on a new role within the community, that of a wise and beloved elder, a figure of guidance and support for all who sought her counsel. She had lived through the darkest of times and emerged stronger and more compassionate than ever before, and her experiences had given her a profound understanding of the human heart and the challenges that each person faced on their own journey through life. And so, as the younger generations began to come of age and take their place within the town, Evelyn made it her mission to pass on the lessons that she had learned, to share the wisdom and the strength that had carried her through the trials of her own life. She became a mentor and a confidant, a source of comfort and inspiration for all who crossed her path. But even as she watched with pride as the town continued to grow and change, Evelyn never forgot the sacrifices that had been made to bring them to this point. She would often visit the lakeshore at sunset, her gaze fixed on the shimmering waters that had once been a place of such darkness and despair. And in those moments, she would remember her beloved Tommy, the bright, curious boy who had been taken from her so cruelly, and whose memory still burned bright in her heart. And yet, even in her grief, Evelyn found a sense of peace and purpose that she had never known before. She knew that Tommy's spirit lived on in the town that he had loved so dearly, in the laughter of the children playing in the streets, in the kindness and compassion that flowed like a healing balm through the hearts of all who called this place home. And so, as the sun began to sink below the horizon and the sky turned to a riot of orange and gold, Evelyn would close her eyes and offer up a silent prayer of gratitude, for the love that had sustained her through the darkest of times, for the community that had become her family, and for the bright, shining future that lay ahead, full of promise and possibility. And so, as the story of Evelyn and the town by the lake drew to a close, the lesson that emerged was one of hope and resilience in the face of even the darkest of challenges. Through the power of compassion and unity, the townspeople had triumphed over the evil that had threatened to consume them, and in doing so, they had discovered a strength and a beauty within themselves that they had never known before. It was a lesson that would be passed down through the generations, a reminder that, No matter how deep the darkness or how daunting the obstacles, there was always a light waiting to be found, always a path forward that could be forged through love and determination. And as the town continued to thrive and grow, as new generations were born and old ones passed on, the spirit of that lesson remained, a beacon of hope and inspiration that would guide them through whatever challenges lay ahead. For Evelyn, the journey had been a long and painful one, a path marked by grief and loss, by struggle and sacrifice. But in the end, she had emerged stronger and wiser than she had ever been before, a living embodiment of the resilience and the courage that had carried her people through the darkest of times. And though she knew that the world beyond the borders of her beloved town was full of its own dangers and challenges, Evelyn faced the future with a heart full of hope and a soul alight with purpose. For she had learned the most precious lesson of all, that in the face of even the greatest darkness, there was always a light to be found, always a way forward that could be forged through love and compassion and the unbreakable bonds of community. And so, as the sun rose over the shimmering waters of the lake and the town began to stir to life once more, Evelyn stepped out into the bright, shining world, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead, knowing that, no matter what challenges the future might bring, she would never face them alone, and that the love and the strength of her people would always be there to guide her home.